Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another video in my PlayStation First Impression series, with today's game being the 9th game in the series in the form of Breath of Fire 4, a game which first saw release in Japan in April 2000 before coming out in North America in November of the same year, and then finally coming out in the PAL territories in August 2001, quite a long time later, and actually a fair bit after the release of the PS2 as well. Like always, with all my first impressions videos, I'll play through the game for around about 60 to 90 minutes before summarising my initial thoughts on the visuals, on the sound, on the gameplay, how much content and lifespan I think the game has to offer, and ultimately whether it's a game I'm going to come back to and play more of before awarding it a final grade based on its first impressions. So far in our PlayStation series, the two standout games have really been Crash Bandicoot 2 and Ridge Racer Type 4. They have been pretty much the best two games by a fair way. And of course, I have played the previous game in the series to this, Breath of Fire 3, and that is a genuinely good RPG that I thoroughly enjoyed. So of course that means the expectations for Breath of Fire 4 are also very high. Once the main menu comes around, you'll see you've got a choice of starting a new game, loading your save data, or heading into options. When you go into options, there are actually a few things that you can tweak, but the most important things are whether you will want automatic running on and whether the camera rotation is standard or reversed. You've also got a few sound options. You can change the volume for both the audio tracks and the sound effects. So the story begins with the characters Nina and Kraid travelling through the desert on their sand flyer before they're unfortunately attacked by a sand dragon, which damages their flyer and renders it immobile towards the edge of the desert. This leads to them having to decide who's going to head off to try and find spare parts and who's going to stay by the sand flyer to prevent it from being stolen by bandits. Ultimately, Kraid decides he will stay to protect the flyer, and Nina should head off to the closest town to try and find some parts. Of course, this leads Nina to find the game's main protagonist, Ryu, who is suffering from amnesia, and she ultimately decides he should join her and they should head off to the local town together. Firstly, to get the parts that she requires, and secondly, to see if there's anybody there who knows Ryu. And of course, the adventure carries on from here. So like I always do, I'm going to start with the visuals first, and Breath of Fire 4 is actually a very nice game visually. It's a clear improvement on the previous game in the series, with both character models and environments looking considerably better. Everything about the game is actually very pleasant on the eyes, whether it's the in-game graphics themselves, the menu presentation, the text choices, and also the way the camera changes to different angles during storyline segments. The animations within battle as well also seem relatively good from my initial time with the game, but as far as how spectacular the special effects get, I couldn't really comment on that because you don't really see a lot of that within the first couple of hours within the game. In fact, the only negative thing I could probably say about the visuals is the camera angle and the fact it's not freely rotatable like in other games at this point in time. A lot of games by the year 2000 had actually adopted the second analog stick as a method for rotating cameras freely within 3D games, which makes playing them in general much better. But unfortunately, in Breath of Fire 4, the camera can only be rotated in chunks of 90 degrees with the R and L buttons, which means when you navigate towns, it can actually be quite frustrating and a bit fiddly because you can't necessarily see where you're actually going very well. Other than this though, Breath of Fire 4 is incredibly pleasant on the eyes. So moving on to the sound effects and music next, and it probably won't come as much of a surprise when I say that the musical tracks, certainly that I've heard thus far within Breath of Fire 4, are incredibly pleasant. I've said it quite a few times now on the channel that I feel RPGs from this point in time had some of the very best creative music that video games have ever seen, and I'll always stand by that. I feel some of the very best soundtracks of all time are from RPGs from this 32-bit era. And whilst Breath of Fire 4 is definitely not the very best, it's not up there with your Final Fantasy 7s in terms of the music quality, it is still very, very nice. In regards to sound effects, I'll say this: they are very much your typical RPG affair. I feel like you could insert these sound effects into 90% of other RPGs ever made, and they would be right at home. There is absolutely nothing really individual or unique about them, but at the same time, they do exactly what you need them to do. So of course, what I will do is give you some of the samples of the music that I've heard so far within the game. Moving on to the gameplay next, and Breath of Fire 4 is very much your traditional JRPG in the sense that you navigate a world map and enter different locations such as towns and dungeon style areas for you to explore. Random battles are here, leveling up your characters is here, and of course improving your character's weapons and equipment is here as well, and the game does all of these things pretty well. In fact, the only negative thing that you could possibly level at Breath of Fire 4 in this regard is the fact that it isn't particularly unique in any way at all. Even the series' unique aspect of characters morphing into dragons isn't really that unique at this point in time, as we'd seen other RPGs by now where characters could change into other creatures. It's worth noting that your characters can actually learn abilities from enemies when they use them on them, but again, this is something that had been seen previously in other RPGs by this point in time. Of course, it's very difficult to summarize the gameplay for an RPG when you've only experienced the first couple of hours of the game, because of course it could well branch out and expand much further into the game. So of course you have to remember I'm summarizing my initial thoughts on the gameplay, and in fact the only truly negative thing that I could say about the way the game plays is related to the controlling of the characters within the 3D environments that you explore, because whilst you can use the analog stick to move your characters, it is very much fixed in an 8-way direction interface, which means it does feel somewhat clunky and can be a little awkward when you're trying to navigate your characters through doorways or across thin bridges or ledges. So moving on to content and lifespan next, and Breath of Fire 4 will take around about 35 to 40 hours to play through the main story, and then potentially over 60 hours if you're going to try and complete everything that the game has to offer. To go with all of the standard RPG elements of the game, we've also got some little mini games that are in there, and they break up the flow quite nicely. They don't take very long to do, and they are a novel change within the gameplay. In terms of how many skills and abilities your characters can learn, it's very difficult for me to put a guess on that, because of course I'm only about 2 hours into the game, but I imagine there are going to be more characters that join your party and a substantial amount of skills, weapons and armors that you can add to your arsenal as well. So I do feel, in terms of content and lifespan, Breath of Fire 4 will potentially be a pretty good game. So like always, that leaves me with my two final questions. Is Breath of Fire 4 a game I'm going to come back to and play more and potentially complete? And what final grade is it going to get based on its first impressions? What I want to say is this first. If you're not a fan of RPGs, Breath of Fire 4 is not the kind of game that's going to convert you into an RPG fan. It is specifically designed for fans of JRPGs alone. So you're either going to like this game or you're not going to like this game. And of course, for me, I'm a huge fan of JRPGs, so I have no doubt that I will invest more time into this game, probably at least 9 or 10 hours, to truly find out whether I'm going to see it through to the end or not. In terms of its first impressions grade, it's pretty solid overall. It's a decent looking game. It sounds good. It plays relatively well as well. And it doesn't really have any major flaws, only the minor ones that I've pointed out so far. So in terms of a final grade, it is going to get a very strong B+. Now you have to take into account that's me as an RPG fan giving you that grade. If you're not an RPG fan, you could probably knock this game down to a C+, because you probably just wouldn't find it as interesting as someone like myself. So in terms of comparing it to the other games that we've taken a look at so far, it is actually right up there as one of the best games we've taken a look at in the series on the PlayStation. But of course, like I always say, these are my thoughts and my thoughts alone. If you bought this game when it came out, if you've played it, let me know what your thoughts on Breath of Fire 4 are down below. And of course, does it branch out and give you more in terms of gameplay the further you get into the game? Let me know your thoughts down below, and like always, I'll be back in the near future with another video. Goodbye for now.